I'm so glad you're here. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom hummed a monotonous, soul-crushing tune, a sound I knew would haunt my sleep for whatever years I had left. They call it the hum of justice, but to me it was the sound of a life being slowly, methodically erased. I sat at the defendant's table, my hands resting on the cheap wood veneer fingers laced together so tightly, my knuckles were white mountains in a pale, trembling landscape. I focused on them, on the tiny imperfections in the wood, on anything but the jury's faces. Their expressions ranged from mild pity to outright boredom, and I couldn't decide which was worse. They saw a woman named Ilara Vance, a single mother, a former data clerk from a low-rent district accused of stealing proprietary code from one of the most powerful tech corporations in the world, Innovate Dynamics. They saw a desperate woman who got greedy. A story as old as time, simple and digestible. It was a lie, of course, but it was a beautifully constructed one, presented by a man in a $10,000 suit whose tailored confidence was worth more than my entire life's savings. My own lawyer, Ben Carter, was a good kid, fresh out of the public defender's office, his suit looking like it was on its first real outing. He was earnest, he believed me, but he was a rowboat trying to stop an aircraft carrier. He shuffled his papers, the sound of rustling paper, a symphony of his own anxiety. Across the room, Julian Croft, the CEO of Innovate Dynamics, sat next to his legal team. He wasn't even trying to look concerned. He had a look of serene, almost philosophical detachment, as if he were watching a play he'd already read the reviews for. He caught my eye for a fraction of a second, and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. A gesture so small, so full of condescending power it made my stomach turn to ice. He knew he had me. Everyone knew. The evidence was a digital noose tightening with every witness. My login credentials, my IP address, fragments of the stolen code found in a deleted folder on my work laptop. It was a perfect, clean, undeniable case. Ben had tried to argue that it was too perfect, too clean, but the prosecutor had just smiled a thin, predatory slash of a smile and said, "Sometimes, Your Honor, criminals are just not as smart as they think they are." And the jury had nodded. Of course they had. Because why would a titan like Julian Croft, a man hailed as a visionary, need to frame a nobody like me? The bailiff's voice boomed, cutting through the thick, stagnant air. All rise. The Court of the Fourth Judicial District is now in session, the Honorable Marcus Thorne presiding. A collective scrape of chairs echoed through the room as everyone stood. I rose with them, my knees feeling weak, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. This was it. The final day. The summations, the instructions to the jury, and then the slow march towards my conviction. I kept my eyes down, fixed on the scuffed toes of my shoes. I couldn't bear to look at the judge's bench. I'd seen his picture, of course. Judge Marcus Thorne. The Iron Judge. A man known for his rigid adherence to the law, for his sharp intellect, and for having zero tolerance for theatrics. He was the worst possible judge for a case like mine, where the only defense I had was an unbelievable truth. The heavy door behind the bench opened, and the rustle of a judicial robe filled the silence. I heard him take his seat, the leather of his high-backed chair groaning under his weight. I forced myself to lift my head to look at the man who was about to send me away from my son, perhaps for decades. He was older than his pictures, his hair a distinguished silver at the temples, his face etched with the lines of a man who carried the weight of 1,000 difficult decisions. He settled his papers, his movements precise and economical. Then, as is custom, he looked out over the courtroom, his gaze sweeping from the prosecution to the defense to the jury, a silent acknowledgement of all the players in this grim theater. And then his eyes met mine. It wasn't a glance. It was a collision. The air left my lungs in a silent whoosh, as if I'd been punched. For a full second, the world just stopped. The humming lights, the shuffling papers, the distant cough from the gallery, it all faded into a roaring silence. Judge Marcus Thorne froze. His hand, which had been reaching for his gavel, stopped midair. His face, a moment ago a mask of stern impartiality, was suddenly stripped bare. I saw his eyes widen, not just in surprise, but in a profound, earth-shattering shock that seemed to rock him to his very core. A flicker of something I couldn't name, disbelief, confusion, maybe even fear, flashed across his features before he caught himself, his judicial mask slamming back into place. But it was too late. I had seen it, and in that moment I knew he remembered. He didn't see Alara Vance, the disgraced data clerk. He saw the ghost sitting at the defendant's table. He saw the woman he and the entire legal world had presumed dead for 15 years. My name isn't Alara Vance. No one in this room knew who I really was, or why the most powerful judge in the state was now staring at me as if he'd just seen the impossible. And as he finally gripped his gavel, his knuckles white, I felt the first spark of something I hadn't felt in a long, long time: hope. The game had just changed. If you're on the edge of your seat like I was in that moment, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. I'm dying to know how far this story travels, so tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Your support means the world, and trust me, you're going to want to be here for the rest of this. Before I was Alara Vance, a shadow living on the frayed edges of society, I was someone else entirely. My name was Annalise Foster, and in the world, Judge Marcus Thorne came from that name meant something. 15 years ago, I wasn't sitting at a defendant's table. I was arguing cases in front of the Supreme Court. I was the youngest partner at Sterling and Finch, one of D.C.'s most prestigious law firms. I was Marcus Thorne's protege. He was a partner at the firm back then before his appointment to the bench, and he was my mentor. He called me his legal sharpshooter, the one he'd bring in when a case seemed impossible, when the logic was so tangled it required not just a lawyer but a surgeon. We were a formidable team. He had the wisdom and the experience. I had a mind that saw patterns others missed, a relentless energy, and an almost pathological need to find the truth. Our world was one of mahogany-paneled offices overlooking the capital of late nights, fueled by black coffee and the thrill of cracking a case of the unspoken respect that exists between two minds operating on the same wavelength. I remember the smell of old leather and expensive scotch in his office, the way he'd lean back in his chair, stroking his chin, as I paced back and forth, unraveling a complex legal theory. "You see things in 3 dimensions, Annalise," he used to say. "Everyone else is reading a flat page." He believed in me, and I, in turn, revered him. He was the kind of man the law was written for, principled, unyielding, and brilliant. The case that changed everything, the one that killed Annalise Foster and gave birth to Alara Vance, was called the Prometheus Project. It was a massive corporate liability case. A subsidiary of a sprawling global conglomerate, Omnicorp, had developed a new type of energy source. It was hailed as revolutionary, a clean, cheap power that would change the world. Cities were bidding to be the first to host a Prometheus plant. But there were whispers, rumors of safety protocols being bypassed, of data being fudged to meet deadlines. We were hired by a group of whistleblowers, engineers from within the project who were terrified. Their case was built on a mountain of technical data, and no one at the firm could make sense of it. No one but me. I spent 3 months locked in a data room, surrounded by blueprints, server logs, and encrypted emails. I barely slept. I lived on caffeine and adrenaline. Marcus would check in on me, bringing me sandwiches. I'd forget to eat, his face etched with a mixture of pride and concern. "Don't burn yourself out, kid," he'd warn. "Even sharpshooters need to reload." But I couldn't stop. I was close. I could feel it. I was chasing a ghost in the machine, a pattern of deleted files and rerouted data streams that pointed to a deliberate high-level cover-up. The moment of discovery came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. The office was silent, the city, a glittering tapestry of lights outside my window. I finally decrypted the last file. It wasn't about fudged safety numbers. It was so much worse. The Prometheus project had a catastrophic flaw. In certain atmospheric conditions, the core could become unstable, creating a chain reaction that was not just dangerous but potentially apocalyptic on a local scale. The file contained simulations. They knew. They had run the numbers, and they knew the plant they were about to bring online in a densely populated area was a time bomb. They had buried the data, fired the engineers who discovered it, and were pushing ahead because the financial incentives were too massive to ignore. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just corporate malfeasance. It was premeditated potential mass murder for profit. I printed everything, my hands shaking. I called Marcus at home, my voice a choked whisper. "Marcus, I found it. It's worse than we ever imagined." He was there in 20 minutes, his face grim as he read through the documents. I saw the color drain from his face. "My God, Annalise," he breathed. This is a weapon. We knew we had to act fast. We planned to take it to the Department of Justice the next morning. It felt like the most important moment of my life, the culmination of everything I'd ever worked for. That night I went home feeling a strange mix of terror and elation. I was about to take down one of the most powerful corporations on the planet. I packed my briefcase, laying out the evidence for the morning. I remember thinking how the world would look different in 24 hours. I was right, just not in the way I expected. When I walked into my apartment, the air was wrong. It was still but heavy. A lamp was knocked over, and on my coffee table there was a single manila envelope. My name was typed on it. Inside there was no letter. There were just photographs. Pictures of me taken over the past few weeks. Me getting coffee. Me walking into the office. Me talking to Marcus. And then a picture that made my heart stop. It was a photo of my younger sister, a college student in California, walking out of her dorm. A red circle was drawn around her face. Underneath it, a single sentence was typed: "Some things are not worth the price of the truth." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. They hadn't just been watching me. They had been mapping my life, my vulnerabilities. They knew Marcus was a man of principle, but I was a woman with a family. They knew exactly where to apply the pressure. Panic, cold, and absolute seized me. This wasn't a legal battle anymore. These weren't people who would fight me in a courtroom. They would destroy my family without a second thought. I thought about the simulations, the cold, calculating evil it took to bury that kind of risk. Erasing one lawyer and her sister would be nothing to them. I had two choices. I could go to the DOJ, hand over the evidence, and pray they could protect my sister from a ghost, a faceless corporation with infinite resources. Or I could disappear. I could take the evidence, bury it, and become someone else, somewhere else. I could sever every tie, erase every trace of Annalise Foster, and in doing so pull my sister out of the line of fire. It was no choice at all. In the space of one night, I became a ghost. I packed a small bag, took every bit of cash I had, and walked out of my life. I wiped my laptop, destroyed my phone, and left a vague note about needing to get away. I knew it would look like I'd cracked under the pressure, that I'd run away. I knew it would destroy my reputation and hurt Marcus deeply. He would think I had abandoned him, abandoned the most important case of our lives. It was a price I had to pay. I bought a bus ticket to a city I'd never heard of, and Annalise Foster died somewhere on a highway in the middle of America. And Ilara Vance was born with nothing but a bag of clothes, a copy of the Prometheus files on a thumb drive hidden in the sole of her shoe, and a vow to never let anyone get close enough to hurt again. And for 15 years I kept that vow. Until now. Life as Ilara Vance was an exercise in anonymity. I moved from one small, forgettable town to another, taking jobs that left no paper trail: waitressing, cleaning hotel rooms, stocking shelves. I learned to be invisible, to keep my head down, to never stay in one place long enough for roots to form. The brilliant, ambitious Annalise Foster was buried under layers of exhaustion and vigilance. My world, once defined by legal precedent and intellectual debate, was now measured in hourly wages and the constant low-grade fear of being found. The thumb drive, my only connection to my past, remained hidden, a toxic secret I carried with me. I told myself it was insurance, a weapon of last resort, but in my heart, I knew I was too afraid to ever use it. The people who had threatened me were powerful, patient, and I had no doubt their reach was long. My sister graduated, got married, and had children. I watched her life unfold from a distance, through carefully anonymized social media searches, my heart aching with a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical illness. She was safe. That was the only thing that mattered. 5 years into my new life, the unexpected happened. I met a man, a kind, gentle carpenter named David Vance. He didn't ask questions about my past. He saw the sadness in my eyes and simply offered a quiet, steady presence. For the first time in years, I let my guard down. We fell in love, got married, and a year later our son Leo was born. Leo. He was my anchor, my reason. Holding him for the first time, I felt a fierce, protective love that dwarfed even the fear that had dictated my life for so long. He was my new vow. For him, I would do anything. For him, I finally settled down in this quiet, unassuming city, hoping we had finally found a safe harbor. We had a few years of fragile, beautiful peace. But the universe has a cruel sense of irony. When Leo was 4, David was killed in a hit-and-run accident. The driver was never found. I told myself it was a tragic, random event. But in the darkest hours of the night, a cold voice would whisper in my mind, wondering if my past had finally caught up to me, if the ghosts I was running from had found a new way to hurt me. I was left alone again, this time with a child to protect. The grief was a physical weight, but I had to keep going for Leo. I took a job at a local library, then another, as a data entry clerk at a small logistics company. The pay was barely enough to cover rent and Leo's mounting medical bills. He'd developed a rare autoimmune disorder, one that required expensive treatments and constant care. My life became a relentless cycle of work, hospital visits, and sleepless nights, my fear for Leo's health a constant gnawing anxiety. That was when I saw the job posting for a data clerk at Innovate Dynamics. It was a massive state-of-the-art campus on the outskirts of the city, the biggest employer in the region. The pay was significantly better than anything I could find elsewhere. It was a risk. A company that big that connected could have ties to my past. But looking at Leo's pale face at the stack of unpaid medical bills on my kitchen table, I knew I had no choice. I had to take the risk. I scrubbed my resume of anything that might look suspicious, invented a plausible work history, and applied. To my surprise, I got the job. My role was mind-numbingly simple, transferring and verifying data from old servers to a new cloud-based system. It was tedious, repetitive work, perfect for someone who wanted to remain unnoticed. For 6 months, it was exactly that. I was a faceless drone in a sea of cubicles. I came in, did my work, and went home. No one looked at me twice. Julian Croft was a name I only saw in company-wide emails, a distant figurehead. And then one rainy afternoon it happened. I was working on a batch of archived files from a company Innovate Dynamics had acquired years ago. The project name on the folder was Project Icarus. As I began migrating the data, a familiar feeling washed over me, a chilling sense of déjà vu. The file structures, the encryption protocols, the way certain data points were systematically corrupted or rerouted, it was identical. My fingers froze over the keyboard. My heart started to hammer against my ribs. With a trembling hand, I used an old diagnostic command from my past, a backdoor trick I hadn't thought about in over a decade. The system churned and a hidden directory flickered onto my screen. It was the same ghost I had chased 15 years ago. The data was different. It wasn't an energy source this time. It was a new line of proprietary medical implants hailed as a breakthrough in neurological treatment. But the cover-up was the same. The raw data showed a significant percentage of the implants had a degenerative flaw, a ticking time bomb that could cause catastrophic neurological damage years after implantation. The public-facing reports, the ones submitted to the FDA, were sanitized, the data manipulated to show a perfect safety record. I felt like I was going to be sick. It was Omnicorp all over again under a new name. Innovate Dynamics was the successor born from the ashes of the old conglomerate after the Prometheus project had been quietly mothballed. And Julian Croft was repeating history. He was knowingly selling a product that would cripple and potentially kill innocent people. Before I could even process what to do, my screen went black. A message appeared in stark white text, "Unauthorized access detected. Your session has been terminated. Please remain at your workstation." 2 minutes later, 2 stone-faced security guards were standing at my cubicle. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." They escorted me through the office, the sudden silence and the stares of my coworkers a humiliating spotlight. In a sterile conference room, a woman from HR and a man from corporate security informed me that a routine audit had discovered I had downloaded and attempted to transfer proprietary source code to an external device. It was a lie. I hadn't downloaded anything. I had only looked. But they showed me logs perfectly forged that implicated me completely. They fired me on the spot and told me not to be surprised when the police showed up at my door. I walked out of that building in a daze, the rain soaking through my thin coat. It wasn't random. They hadn't just discovered my snooping. They had been watching me. They had a file on me, a pre-made trap ready to spring the moment I got too close. The frame-up was an act of surgical precision. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that this wasn't just about silencing me. It was about making an example of me, ensuring that whatever I had seen, no one would ever believe me. I was no longer an anonymous data clerk. I was the perfect scapegoat. Back in the courtroom, the prosecutor, a sharp, ambitious woman named Gabriela Reyes, was painting her masterpiece of my guilt. She moved with a liquid grace, her voice a finely tuned instrument that could project righteous indignation one moment and sympathetic disappointment the next. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began her summation, her eyes sweeping across their faces, making a connection with each one. "The story you have heard from the defense is one of fantasy, a grand conspiracy, a shadowy corporation with a diabolical plot. It's a story worthy of a Hollywood blockbuster. But we are not in a movie theater. We are in a court of law. And in a court of law, we deal with facts." She paused, letting the word facts hang in the air. "And the facts, the cold, hard, digital facts, are undeniable." She gestured towards a large screen where the evidence was displayed in a clean, damning flowchart. Fact: the stolen code, worth millions of dollars, was accessed using the defendant's unique login credentials. Fact: the code was copied to a partitioned drive on the defendant's workstation, a drive hidden from plain view. Fact: forensic analysis found traces of the defendant attempting to transfer this data to an external untraceable server just moments before she was apprehended. Every word was a nail in my coffin. Ben had tried to counter, tried to introduce the possibility of a remote intrusion of spoofed credentials, but Reyes had an army of tech experts from Innovate Dynamics who testified with unshakable certainty. They were polished, professional, and they methodically dismantled every one of Ben's arguments, making him look like an amateur, a conspiracy theorist out of his depth. My heart ached for him. He was fighting so hard, but he was bringing a knife to a drone strike. Now the architect of my destruction, Julian Croft, was back on the stand for the final time. He was the prosecution's star witness, the noble victim of this betrayal. He looked directly at the jury, his expression a perfect blend of sorrow and resolve. "I built Innovate Dynamics from the ground up," he said, his voice resonating with sincerity. "Our mission has always been to innovate, to heal, to make the world a better place. The code, Miss Vance Stoll, wasn't just a product. It was the culmination of years of research, the hope for thousands of patients suffering from debilitating neurological conditions. He was a master. He wasn't just a CEO. He was a savior, and I was the monster who had tried to steal hope from the sick and dying. When we discovered the breach," he continued, shaking his head slowly, "I was devastated. Not for the financial loss, but for the betrayal of trust. Miss Vance was a member of our team. We gave her an opportunity, and she chose to repay that trust with theft." Reyes led him through his testimony with surgical precision. "Mr. Croft, did you have any reason to believe Miss Vance was a disgruntled employee?" "No," he said, his voice heavy with feigned regret. "She was quiet, kept to herself. In hindsight, perhaps we should have seen the signs. But we believe in giving people the benefit of the doubt. It was brilliant. He was painting me not as a criminal mastermind, but as a pathetic, overlooked woman who lashed out. It was a narrative the jury could understand, could believe." Ben rose to cross-examine, his hands trembling slightly. He tried to poke holes in Croft's story. "Mr. Croft, isn't it true that Innovate Dynamics acquired a company called Omnicorp 5 years ago? That's a matter of public record, yes. And Omnicorp had a project called the Prometheus Project, which was shut down due to irregularities." Reyes was on her feet instantly. "Objection, Your Honor." Relevance Judge Thorne sustained the objection before Ben could even finish his sentence. "Counselor, stick to the matter at hand." My mind was racing, screaming the connections that Ben didn't know, that he couldn't possibly articulate. It's the same cover-up, the same methodology. The Icarus implant data is a mirror image of the Prometheus reactor data. Ask him about the data sanitation protocols. Ask him about the engineers who were fired from both projects. But I could say nothing. To the court, I was a Lara Vance data clerk. Any such knowledge would be inexplicable further proof of my guilt. I was trapped in my own lie, a prison I had built for myself 15 years ago. I risked a glance at the judge's bench. Marcus Thorne's face was an unreadable cipher. He sat impassively, his hands steepled in front of him. But his eyes were fixed on me, and behind the judicial calm I saw the storm. He was watching me, listening to every word, and I knew he was seeing the same things I was. He saw the elegant, almost invisible threads of a high-level conspiracy, the kind we used to unravel together over cold coffee at 2 a.m. He couldn't act on it, he couldn't intervene based on a memory, but I knew in the deepest part of my soul that he was seeing the ghost of Annalise Foster, and he was starting to believe she wasn't a thief. The problem was believing it, and being able to do anything about it were two entirely different worlds. As Ben sat down defeated, and Reyes rested her case with a confident smile, the weight of those 15 years pressed down on me. I had run to protect my family, to stay safe. But in doing so, I had stripped myself of my greatest weapon, my voice, my history, my truth. And now that silence was about to cost me everything. The court recessed for lunch, and the brief reprieve felt more like a stay of execution than a break. Ben led me to a small, windowless conference room reserved for public defenders. The air was stale, smelling of cheap coffee and desperation. He collapsed into a plastic chair, dropping his legal pad onto the table with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire justice system. "I'm sorry, Alara," he said, running a hand through his already messy hair. I'm outmatched." Their experts are seamless. Croft is untouchable. Every time I think I have an angle, they shut it down. The judge isn't giving us an inch. He looked genuinely defeated, and a part of me that I thought had died long ago, the part that mentored young associates that guided them through their first trials, felt a pang of sympathy for him. He was a good lawyer, a good man. He was just fighting a war without knowing what the real stakes were or who the real enemy was. For 15 years, my survival had depended on one rule: trust no one. Every relationship was temporary, every conversation guarded. But looking at Ben's crestfallen face, at the genuine belief in his eyes, every time he looked at me, I realized my old rules were no longer applicable. My silence was a luxury I could no longer afford. If I was going down, I wasn't going down without a fight. And right now, Ben was the only weapon I had. I had to take a chance. I had to trust him with something. Not everything, not yet, but a piece. A thread he could pull on. "Ben," I said, my voice quiet but firm. He looked up, his eyes weary. "You're not outmatched. You're just fighting on the wrong battlefield. You're trying to prove I'm innocent. You need to start proving they're lying." "How?" he asked, a note of frustration in his voice. "Their digital forensics are airtight." "No, they're not," I said, leaning forward. "They're clean, too clean. It's like a perfectly staged crime scene. There's no digital dust, no stray fragments. When you execute a remote intrusion and frame someone from the inside, you have to be meticulous. But there are always Tell's signatures that a casual observer would miss." I could see a flicker of intrigue pierce through his exhaustion. "What kind of signatures?" "They're expert." I began, trying to recall the name from the testimony. "Dr. Alistair Finch, the one who testified about the server logs. He's good, but he's arrogant. He presented the logs as a linear, unbroken chain of events. My login, the file, accessed the copy command. But that's not how complex server architecture works, especially not with tiered security like they have at Innovate. There are handshakes, authentication pings, latency artifacts between different server clusters. The legal jargon, the technical terms from my past life came tumbling out, and I saw Ben's eyes widen slightly. This was not the language of a low-level data clerk. "What are you saying?" he asked, leaning forward now, too. "I'm saying you need to recall him to the stand," I said, my pulse quickening. "This was the gamble. You need to ask him a very specific question. Don't ask him if the logs were altered. He'll say no, and he'll be technically correct. The log entries themselves are likely genuine. You need to ask him to display the timestamp metadata for each entry down to the millisecond and to correlate it with the corresponding network latency logs from the physical security servers." Ben stared at me, a look of profound confusion on his face. The latency logs, why? What will that show? A real user sitting at a terminal inside the building will have near zero latency between their keyboard command and the server action. "The handshake is instantaneous," I explained, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "But a remote intrusion, even one routed cleverly through their own internal network to mask its origin, will have a delay. It might only be a few milliseconds, a tiny, insignificant blip, but it will be there. A digital fingerprint. The command to copy the files will have a slightly different latency signature than the login command that preceded it. It's the ghost in the machine. Ask him to show the court that data. He'll try to evade, he'll say it's irrelevant, but you have to insist." Ben was silent for a long moment, staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. The questions were swirling in his eyes. "Who are you? How do you know this?" But to his credit, he didn't ask. He saw the desperation and the conviction on my face. He picked up his legal pad and began to write, his hand moving with a newfound energy. "Timestamp metadata," he muttered, scribbling. "Correlate with physical security server latency logs." He looked up at me, his expression now one of grim determination. "They'll fight it. Reyes will object. The judge will probably shut it down. I know, I said. But you have to try. You have to put it on the record. You have to make the judge see that there are questions that haven't been answered, that the perfect case has imperfections. It might be our only shot. He nodded slowly, a silent agreement passing between us. As we walked back towards the courtroom, I felt a tremor of fear. I had just shown my hand, just a single card from a deck no one knew I held. I had no idea if it would work, or if it would only serve to confirm their suspicions and tighten the noose, but for the first time since my arrest, I wasn't just a passive victim. I was a lawyer again, drafting a strategy from the confines of a prison I had built myself. The afternoon session began with a jury filing back in their faces, showing the fatigue of a long trial. The air was thick with finality. Gabriela Reyes gave Ben a condescending smile as he approached the podium as if to say, "What futile gesture are you going to attempt now, Your Honor?" Ben said, his voice clearer and more confident than it had been all morning. The defense would like to recall Dr. Alistair Finch to the stand for a few brief questions regarding the forensic data. Reyes shot to her feet. Objection. The witness has been thoroughly examined and cross-examined. The defense is stalling. Your Honor, Ben countered, his voice. Steady new clarity has arisen regarding the technical evidence presented, and for the sake of a complete record, we feel it is imperative to clarify one point. I held my breath. This was the first hurdle. Judge Thorne looked down at Ben, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he was silent. I could almost feel the gears turning in his head. He had to know this was unusual. He had to be connecting my intense stare from this morning with this sudden, specific technical request. He looked from Ben to me and back again. "I'll allow it," he said, his voice a low gravel. "But make it brief, Mr. Carter." Reyes sat down, her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. A small wave of relief washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. "Doctor?" Finch, the lead forensic expert from Innovate Dynamics, retook the stand with an air of annoyed impatience. He was a man in his late 40s with a perfectly trimmed beard and an ego that entered the room before he did. He looked at Ben as if he were a particularly slow student. Ben, clutching his notes, took a deep breath. "Dr. Finch," he began, "you testified this morning that the server logs show an unbroken and linear chain of events leading to the data theft. Is that correct?" "As I've stated multiple times, yes." "The digital trail is unequivocal," Finch said, barely hiding his condescension. "And you are completely confident in the integrity of those logs?" "Absolutely," Finch scoffed. "They are immutable." "Excellent," Ben said, taking a step closer to the witness box. "Then you would have no objection to displaying those logs for the court again. Specifically, I'd like to see the entry for the defendant's login at 143217 and the file copy command initiated at 143542. Finch sighed dramatically and nodded to the tech assistant who brought the logs up on the large screen. The lines of code and timestamps appeared stark and clinical. "As you can see," Finch said, with a wave of his hand irrefutable. "Thank you, Dr. Ben," said his voice calm. "Now could you please expand the metadata for both of those entries to show the full timestamp down to the 10,000th of a second?" Finch frowned. "That's hardly necessary. The data is clear. Please, Doctor." For the sake of thoroughness, Ben insisted. Reyes started to rise, but Judge Thorne silenced her with a look. He was leaning forward now, his eyes narrowed, fixed on the screen. With another exasperated sigh, Finch instructed the assistant to expand the data. A longer string of numbers appeared next to each entry. And now Ben said, his heart audibly pounding in the quiet courtroom, "Could you please overlay the corresponding network latency logs from the building's physical security servers for those exact moments?" This was it. Finch's composure finally cracked. I don't see the relevance of that, counselor." That's a completely different system. Correlating them is complex and unnecessary. Is it, Ben pressed? Or is it just inconvenient for your narrative? Your Honor, the defense contends that this data is crucial to establishing the true origin of the commands. Judge Thorne stared at Finch for a long, heavy moment. The witness will comply with the request. A tense silence fell over the courtroom as the tech assistant, now looking nervous himself, typed a series of commands. A new set of data, a graph with tiny spikes, appeared on the screen next to the logs. The room was so quiet you could hear the soft whir of the computer's fan. Dr. Finch, Ben, said, his voice ringing with newfound authority. Could you please explain to the jury what we are seeing here? Finch cleared his throat. It's network latency data. The time it takes for a signal to travel from a terminal to the server. Exactly, Ben said. And what is the latency for the login command at 1432? Finch squinted at the screen. It appears to be 0.8 milliseconds. Consistent with an internal network command. And now Dr. Ben said, his voice dropping as he pointed to the second entry. What is the latency for the file copy command? 3 minutes later, Finch was silent. He stared at the screen, his face paling slightly. Dr. Ben prompted. The latency, Finch stammered, his arrogance completely gone, is 19.4 milliseconds. A gasp rippled through the jury box. 19 milliseconds, Ben repeated, letting the number sink in. More than 20 times greater. A delay that is statistically insignificant for a user but forensically massive. A delay, Doctor, that is not consistent with a command being entered on a local terminal, but is consistent with a command that has been routed remotely, perhaps from outside the building, and masked to appear as an internal user. Isn't that correct? Finch was speechless. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked desperately towards the prosecution table, but Reyes was staring at him with undisguised fury. Julian Croft's serene mask had slipped. For the first time, he looked genuinely angry. The perfect case now had a gaping, unexplainable hole in it. It wasn't enough to prove my innocence, not by a long shot. But it was doubt. It was a seed of doubt, planted right in the heart of their pristine evidence. As Judge Thorne called for a brief recess, his eyes met mine across the courtroom. There was no acknowledgement, no sign, but I saw it. The rigid mask of the Iron Judge had a crack in it, and through that crack I could see the mind of my old mentor, Marcus Thorne, beginning to work, beginning to see the ghost in his courtroom for what she truly was. The atmosphere outside the courthouse was electric. The small crack Ben had managed to put in the prosecution's case had sent a shockwave through the proceedings. Reporters who had previously been treating my trial as a foregone conclusion were now buzzing with speculation. I could see them whispering, pointing at Julian Croft as he stormed out of the building, his face a thunderous mask of rage. He wasn't used to losing control. He wasn't used to things not going exactly as planned, and that made him infinitely more dangerous. Ben and I walked down the marble steps, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. "You were brilliant, Ben," I said, "and I meant it." "I just followed your instructions," he replied, a dazed but proud look on his face. He was starting to realize this case was something far beyond what he'd ever imagined. "What do we do now?" "Now," I said, my voice low as we moved through the throng of people, "we have to be very, very careful. We didn't just introduce doubt. We rattled a very large, very dangerous cage." My words proved prophetic sooner than I expected. That evening, as I was walking the 2 blocks from the bus stop to my small apartment, a sleek black town car pulled up beside me, its engine a low, menacing purr. The back window glided down silently, revealing a man I didn't recognize. He was impeccably dressed, with cold, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through me. He wasn't a thug. He was a corporate soldier, the kind of man who handled problems quietly and efficiently. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion.